Veil of Shadows. In the heart of the city, where the streets glowed under neon signs and the hum of life drowned in the whispers of ancient magic, they lived among us, vampires and witches, hidden in plain sight. The city of Eiradon was an unassuming metropolis. It sprawled along the coast, a thriving hub of trade and culture, and at first glance it was just like any other modern city. People rushed to their 9-to-5s, coffee shops bustled with tired faces, and taxis zipped between towering glass buildings. But beneath the surface, beyond what most could see, a network of secrets ran deep. It was a city built on old bones, where the shadows were longer, darker, and more dangerous than anyone knew. Chapter 1. The Midnight Market. A young woman, Talia, moved through the throngs of people in Eiradon's downtown district, her red hair a fiery splash against the drab city colors. Her steps were purposeful, her eyes glinting with a secret knowledge. To the casual observer, she was just another face in the crowd. A student, a barista, maybe an artist. No one could guess that she was a witch, born from a bloodline that stretched back to the time when magic ruled the world. Talia had grown up learning the ancient ways of the coven in the hidden corners of the city, places only those with magic could see. Her family's magic was tied to the elements, but Talia's gift, her unique power, was the ability to bend shadows to her will. As she walked, the city's lights seemed to flicker around her, the shadows creeping closer as if eager to serve her unspoken command. She was headed to the Midnight Market, a hidden bazaar where the city's supernatural residents bartered in secrets, blood, and spells. It only opened once a week, at the stroke of midnight, in a location that shifted constantly to avoid prying mortal eyes. Tonight, it was in an abandoned warehouse by the docks, a place thick with the scent of salt and decay. The entrance was marked by nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air, a ripple that passed unnoticed by anyone who didn't know to look for it. Inside, the market was alive with the strange and the mystical. Booths of potions, charms, and enchanted trinkets lined the walls. A vampire stood behind one of the stalls, offering vials of ancient blood, rumored to grant temporary immunity to the sun. A fey creature flitted by, whispering of bargains that no sane mortal would dare take. And in the far corner, a hooded figure sold stolen memories, the glass jars glowing softly as they captured the essence of forgotten moments. Talia made her way to her usual contact, a vampire named Adrien. His pale skin contrasted sharply with his sleek, dark attire, and his eyes, always calculating, seemed to see everything. Adrien had been a vampire for over 3 centuries, but his sharp wit and effortless charm helped him blend into the city's elite. By day, he worked as a venture capitalist, but by night, he thrived in the supernatural underworld. Talia, he greeted her smoothly, his voice like silk. I trust you've come for something more than a friendly visit? I need a favor, she replied, her voice hushed despite the cacophony of magical voices surrounding them. Something is happening in the city, something dark. The coven can feel it. Adrien raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing. Darkness is nothing new in this city. What's different now? Talia leaned in closer, her breath a whisper against his ear. There's a new player in town, one that neither the coven nor the vampires control. It's older and more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Ones. Unbeknownst to most, there was a third faction in the city. Creatures even more ancient than vampires or witches. They were called the Forgotten Ones, beings that had existed before humans, before magic itself took form. These beings, bound by neither time nor flesh, were remnants of a world long gone, waiting in the shadows, feeding on fear and despair. And now they had awoken. For weeks, strange occurrences had rippled through Eiradon, reports of people disappearing, only to return days later with no memory of where they had been. Others spoke of dreams filled with a suffocating darkness, a presence that clawed at their minds. The witches had sensed a shift in the balance of power, and Talia's coven had become increasingly uneasy. Adrien had heard whispers too. Vampires had gone missing, their bodies drained not of blood, but of life itself. It wasn't the work of hunters or rival covens. It was something more sinister, something primal. What do you need from me? Adrien asked, his voice dropping to a serious tone. Information, Talia said. You have contacts in every corner of this city. Someone must know where they're hiding. Adrien studied her for a moment before nodding. Very well, but be careful. If the Forgotten Ones are involved, we're all in danger. Even vampires. Talia didn't need to be reminded of the danger. She had felt the icy grip of their magic during her last ritual. It was a darkness that seeped into your soul, whispering promises of power while slowly draining your life. It was the kind of magic that could consume the entire city if left unchecked. Chapter 3: The Unveiling. Over the next few days, the city seemed to pulse with an underlying tension. Talia and Adrien worked together, their unlikely alliance kept secret from their respective communities. The coven would not approve of her dealings with a vampire, and Adrien's kind would see it as a betrayal. But the stakes were too high. Through their combined efforts, they tracked the source of the disturbances to an old church on the outskirts of the city. It had been abandoned for decades, but now, dark energy swirled around it, almost palpable to those sensitive enough to feel it. When they arrived, the air was thick with magic. The sky above seemed darker than it should have been, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as though reality itself was beginning to fray. Inside, they found the Forgotten Ones, twisted figures, half shadow, half flesh, gathered in a circle around a dark, pulsing orb. It was a fragment of their lost world, a piece of the void they sought to return to. Their whispers filled the room, and the very air seemed to vibrate with their ancient power. Talia and Adrien knew they were outmatched, but they had no choice. If the Forgotten Ones succeeded in fully awakening, Eiradon would fall, and with it, the fragile balance that had kept the vampires, witches, and other supernatural beings hidden. With a whispered incantation, Talia called upon the shadows, bending them to her will. They rose like living tendrils, wrapping around the Forgotten Ones, pulling them away from the orb. Adrien moved in a blur, his vampiric speed making him a lethal force as he struck at their twisted forms. But the battle was far from easy. The Forgotten Ones were powerful, their very existence defying the natural laws of magic and life. For every blow they struck, it seemed like the darkness closed in, suffocating, relentless. In the end, it was not brute force that won the day. Talia realized that the key to defeating them lay in severing their connection to the orb, the anchor to their forgotten world. With Adrien's help, she channeled her magic, weaving a spell of severance that ripped the orb from their grasp, sending it, and the Forgotten Ones, back into the void. As the darkness dissipated, the church fell silent. Eiradon returned to its usual rhythm, the city unaware of the battle that had taken place beneath its surface. The midnight market continued to thrive, and the vampires and witches resumed their lives in the shadows. But Talia and Adrien knew that things had changed. The veil between the worlds had been torn, if only for a moment, and the Forgotten Ones had left their mark. They knew it was only a matter of time before another force rose from the shadows. And when it did, they would be ready. For in a city like Eiradon, nothing was ever truly hidden. The shadows always held secrets. Chapter 4: Unspoken Alliances. In the days following the battle at the church, Eiradon wore a mask of normalcy. People went to work, had drinks in busy bars, and returned to their homes, unaware of the ancient powers that had stirred in their city. Yet beneath the surface, a ripple of tension could be felt by those who knew where to look. The vampires had grown quiet, the witches more vigilant. Even the supernatural creatures that frequented the midnight market seemed uneasy, their gazes darting towards shadows as though expecting something to leap from the dark at any moment. Talia felt it too. Despite their victory, a sense of foreboding lingered in her mind, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Every time she performed a spell, she could feel a slight resistance, as though the very fabric of the city had been altered by their encounter with the Forgotten Ones. Magic didn't flow as easily as it once had. There were fractures in the world, small but growing, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something worse crept through. Her coven was becoming suspicious. Talia had kept her alliance with Adrien secret, but her absence from recent meetings, the hints of dark magic surrounding her, had not gone unnoticed. The leader of her coven, a stern woman named Seraphine, had already asked pointed questions. Seraphine was old, far older than Talia, and her power was as formidable as it was ancient. She had been through the rise and fall of empires, seen kingdoms burn, and through it all, she had protected the witches of Eiradon. One evening, as Talia prepared to leave her small apartment, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The candles flickered, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. A soft voice, both familiar and commanding, broke the silence. "You've been keeping secrets, Talia." Talia turned slowly to see Seraphine standing in the corner, her tall frame wrapped in a cloak of deep midnight blue. Her silver hair, always meticulously braided, shimmered in the dim light, and her eyes, those piercing, storm-gray eyes, held Talia in place. "I'm doing what's necessary," Talia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "For the coven. For the city." Seraphine stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. "You've been working with a vampire." The accusation hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on Talia's chest. She hadn't expected Seraphine to find out so soon, though she knew it had been inevitable. "I had no choice," Talia said firmly. "The Forgotten Ones." "I know about the Forgotten Ones," Seraphine interrupted, her voice cold. "I felt their presence, but you should have come to the coven. We do not need the help of the undead." Talia clenched her fists. "Adrien isn't like the others. Seraphine's eyes flashed, and the room seemed to darken. "He is exactly like the others. Do not fool yourself into thinking otherwise. Vampires are parasites. They take and take until there is nothing left, and when this city falls, it will be because of alliances like yours." Talia could feel the magic stirring around Seraphine, the power of the coven coiling tightly in the air, but she refused to back down. "With all due respect," she said quietly, "if it weren't for Adrien, the Forgotten Ones would still be here. We wouldn't have stood a chance without him." Seraphine's expression softened just for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "This is not about gratitude, Talia. It's about survival. We do not trust vampires, and we do not work with them. Not anymore." She turned toward the door, her back rigid with authority. "Do not test my patience again." As she left, the room warmed slightly, but the tension remained. Talia stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding. She knew she had crossed a line, but she couldn't regret her decision. The threat was too great, and the lines between friend and foe were no longer so clear. Chapter 5. The Balance Shifts. Across the city, Adrien was facing a similar dilemma. The vampire courts, though fractured and competitive, had become restless. The older ones, those who had survived centuries of bloodshed and politics, knew that something was shifting in Eiradon. Vampires were predators, and they could smell change in the air. Adrien sat in his penthouse, staring out over the glittering skyline. The view was breathtaking, a symbol of the wealth and power he had accumulated over his long existence. But tonight, it felt hollow. His contact in the vampire courts, a young but ambitious vampire named Lucien, had brought troubling news. The ancient vampires were growing paranoid, and whispers of the Forgotten Ones had reached their ears. Many believed that Adrien had involved himself in something dangerous, something that could bring unwanted attention to their kind. "What do they expect me to do?" Adrien muttered, swirling the glass of blood-red wine in his hand. Lucien, standing by the window, gave a sharp smile. "They expect you to choose a side." Adrien frowned. "There is no side. The witches want to keep the city stable, and so do we. The Forgotten Ones are a threat to us all." Lucien shrugged. "The elders don't see it that way. They think you're getting too close to the witches, especially that one, Talia. They fear you'll let old rivalries fade in the face of this new threat." Adrien raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think?" Lucien met his gaze, the smile never leaving his lips. "I think you're playing a dangerous game. The witches are useful, for now, but they're not to be trusted." Adrien took a slow sip of his drink, considering his options. The truth was, Lucien was right. The alliance with Talia was a fragile one, based more on necessity than trust. And yet, Adrien couldn't shake the feeling that Talia was different. She was sharp, resourceful, and most importantly, she had vision. She saw the bigger picture, the need for unity in a time when the old boundaries no longer held. "Tell the elders to mind their own affairs," Adrien said finally. "I'll handle the witches." Lucien's smile widened. "Of course. Just be careful. Alliances like these, they have a way of ending in blood." Chapter 6. The Waking Storm. Despite the growing tensions, the true threat in Eiradon continued to build in the shadows. The city's magical foundations, once stable, had been shaken by the battle at the church. The Forgotten Ones had been banished back to their void, but the breach had not fully closed. Strange phenomena began to ripple across the city. Buildings would flicker in and out of existence, as if caught between two realities. People reported seeing shadowy figures on the edges of their vision, disappearing the moment they turned to look. The city's ley lines, ancient veins of magic that crisscrossed beneath the streets, had become unstable, like fault lines before an earthquake. Talia felt the strain every time she cast a spell. Even the simplest incantation required twice the effort, and the magic felt raw, unpredictable, like trying to control a raging fire with nothing but her bare hands. One night, as she and Adrien met in a secluded alley behind a forgotten library, the air around them seemed to hum with energy. The shadows felt thicker, the silence too oppressive. Talia looked around, sensing the disturbance before she even spoke. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrien nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened street. "The veil is thinning. The Forgotten Ones may be gone, but something else is trying to break through." Talia swallowed hard, her fingers twitching with the need to cast a protective spell, though she knew it would offer little comfort. "We need to find the source of this disruption. If we don't, the city will tear itself apart." Adrien turned to her, his gaze intense. "Then we don't have much time." As they stood in the dark alley, the shadows around them began to twist and writhe, as if alive. Something ancient was stirring beneath Eiradon, something older than the Forgotten Ones, older than magic itself. The storm was coming, and when it hit, there would be no place left to hide. Chapter 7. Threads of the Past. Eiradon's history was written in blood, magic, and shadows. Long before it became a bustling city, it was a place of power, where ancient beings, both human and otherwise, gathered to perform rituals that shaped the very fabric of reality. These rituals left scars, unseen to most, but ever present for those attuned to the supernatural. Talia knew this better than anyone. Her coven's grimoire, a tome passed down through generations, was filled with half-forgotten spells, warnings, and cryptic messages from witches long dead. As she sat in her apartment late that night, flipping through its brittle pages by candlelight, she searched for something, anything, that might explain the growing instability in the city. She traced her fingers along the faded ink, feeling the weight of the centuries in every line. The language was archaic, a mix of Latin and Old English, with symbols that pulsed faintly with latent magic. She paused on a passage that seemed familiar. "Beware the waking storm, for it is born of what came before. That which is forgotten may be forgiven, but not undone." The words sent a chill down her spine. They had been written by Alira, the founder of her coven, a witch so powerful that stories of her magic still circulated in hushed whispers. Alira had led the witches through the darkest periods of Eiradon's history, times when magic had nearly torn the city apart. But there was always one chapter missing from her legend, a mystery that had never been solved. Something Alira had seen, something she had faced, but never written about in full. Talia frowned, her eyes narrowing on the page. The waking storm. It was a phrase that had come up before in coven discussions, but no one had ever been able to fully explain its meaning. Some believed it referred to an apocalyptic event, others thought it was metaphorical, a warning about the dangers of unbridled magic. But now, Talia wasn't so sure. There was a knock at her door, sharp and unexpected. Talia stiffened, her hand moving instinctively to the small crystal pendant around her neck. The wards she'd placed on her apartment hadn't been triggered, which meant whoever was outside wasn't an immediate threat, or they were powerful enough to bypass her protections entirely. With a muttered incantation, she opened the door to reveal a familiar face. Lucien, the young vampire who worked for Adrien. He stood in the doorway, his usual smirk absent, replaced with an expression of cold seriousness. His eyes glinted in the dim hallway light, reflecting something darker than usual. "Talia," he greeted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Talia raised an eyebrow. "Breaking and entering? Very polite." Lucien ignored the jab, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on the open grimoire. "You're looking for answers in the past. That's smart." He met her eyes, his voice low and urgent. But it won't be enough. Talia crossed her arms. She'd never trusted Lucien, not fully. His motives were always shadowed, his loyalty to Adrien unquestionable, but his personal ambitions were harder to read. "What do you want, Lucien?" she asked, leaning against the table. "Adrien sent you?" Lucien shook his head. "This isn't about Adrien. This is bigger than either of us, bigger than him." He paused, his expression unreadable. "I've been digging into the city's past. There are things that even vampires don't know about this place, things that were hidden long before we arrived." Talia felt a familiar tug of unease. What things? Lucien stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's an ancient force beneath Eiradon. It predates the witches, predates even the Forgotten Ones. Whatever happened at the church was just the beginning. The city is sitting on a fault line between worlds, worlds that were sealed off a long time ago." He glanced at the grimoire, nodding toward the passage Talia had been reading. "The waking storm. It's not just an event, it's a being, something that was imprisoned here millennia ago." Talia's heart skipped a beat. "A being? What kind of being?" Lucien's lips curled into a grim smile. "A god." Chapter 8. The Fallen God. The weight of Lucien's words pressed on Talia like a crushing wave. A god, something ancient, something powerful, hidden beneath the streets of Eiradon. It seemed impossible, and yet, in a city steeped in magic and old secrets, it made an eerie kind of sense. Talia closed the grimoire, her fingers trembling slightly. "How do you know this? What proof do you have?" Lucien met her gaze, his expression dark and serious. "There are records, older than anything the vampires or witches have access to. They've been passed down through generations of supernatural scholars, hidden in places no one would think to look. Adrien's network unearthed some of these documents when we were investigating the Forgotten Ones. That's how we learned about the fault lines, the cracks between worlds that run beneath the city." Talia felt the pulse of magic in the air shift slightly, the atmosphere growing heavier with each word. "You think this god is waking up?" Lucien nodded. "I don't just think it. I know it. Every time magic is used in the city, it's feeding into those cracks. The ritual you and Adrien performed at the church, it weakened the barriers. You didn't close the breach, you widened it." Talia's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. The instability in the city, the disturbances in the ley lines, the growing resistance in her magic. It all made sense now. The Forgotten Ones had been the harbingers, the first sign of something much worse. But a god? "What kind of god are we talking about?" Talia asked, her voice hushed. "Is this something we can fight?" Lucien hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, oblivious to the brewing storm. "It's not a god in the way you're thinking. It's older than the gods humans worshipped. The texts refer to it as Nekhthar, a being of pure chaos and darkness. It was sealed away by those who came before us, long before witches, vampires, or even humans existed in their current form. The world was different then." Talia sat down heavily in the chair, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was hearing. "If this thing wakes up, it'll devour everything," Lucien finished, his voice grim. "It's a force of nature, not a being you can reason with. It will consume the city, the magic, the people, everything. It thrives on chaos." The words hung in the air, and Talia felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The coven had always spoken of balance, of the delicate equilibrium that kept the world in harmony. But if what Lucien was saying was true, that balance had already been shattered. "And you think Adrien knows about this?" Talia asked, her voice low. Lucien's smirk returned, but it was tinged with bitterness. "Adrien knows a lot of things, but he's pragmatic. If he can find a way to survive this, he will, whether that means helping us or abandoning us to the chaos." Talia's stomach twisted at the thought. Adrien had always been a master of survival, a creature who thrived in the shadows of power and manipulation. She had trusted him, more than she should have, perhaps. But now she wasn't so sure. "What do we do?" Talia asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucien's eyes gleamed with a predatory light. "We stop it. We find the source of the breach, the place where the seal is weakest, and we close it for good." Talia stood, determination hardening in her chest. "And if we can't?" Lucien's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then we burn the city down, before it has a chance to take us all." Chapter 9. A City on the Edge. The cracks were spreading. All across Eiradon, strange occurrences were becoming more frequent, more dangerous. Buildings shook with tremors that had no earthly explanation. The air crackled with electricity, thick with the scent of impending rain, though no storm had yet broken. People began to vanish without a trace, their disappearances unexplained even by supernatural means. Adrien stood at the top of one of Eiradon's tallest skyscrapers, looking out over the city that had been his home for centuries. The skyline was bathed in the pale light of the full moon, and yet there was something ominous in the air. The city felt wrong. He hadn't spoken to Talia since Lucien's report. There were too many pieces in motion, too many variables to account for. The vampire courts were on edge, the witches were preparing for war, and all the while, the city itself was teetering on the brink of collapse. Behind him, Lucien appeared out of the shadows, his expression grim. "It's getting worse." Adrien didn't turn. "I know." "We need to act," Lucien said. "Talia's coven is mobilizing. They're planning something big, something dangerous. If they disrupt the wrong ley line." Chapter 10. Fractured Loyalties. Adrien's gaze lingered on the city below, the flickering lights of Eiradon forming a patchwork of urban life, oblivious to the chaos brewing beneath its streets. The fault lines were no longer a theoretical problem. They were a living, breathing danger. He could feel it in the air, taste it in the blood of his latest victim. The pulse of the city had changed, becoming erratic, like a heart beating just before it gave out. Lucien shifted behind him, his patience wearing thin. Talia's coven will rip the city apart if they go through with whatever they're planning. They don't understand what they're dealing with. If they touch the wrong ley line, if they release more of Nekhthar's essence, the barriers could collapse entirely. Adrien finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. He had always been an enigma, even to those closest to him. His face was smooth, ageless, but his eyes held the weight of centuries of bloodshed, betrayal, and survival. He didn't need to speak for Lucien to feel the tension between them. "The witches think they can control the situation," Adrien said softly. "They're mistaken." Lucien scoffed, stepping closer. "You've been playing both sides too long, Adrien. You can't keep balancing the coven and the courts. The Forgotten Ones were just the beginning. The city's breaking apart, and we need to make a choice." Adrien's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You misunderstand, Lucien. I'm not balancing anything. I'm buying time." Lucien narrowed his eyes, suspicion flaring. Time for what? Adrien turned back toward the city, his hands clasped behind his back, for the real power to reveal itself. Talia stood in the center of the coven's sanctum, deep beneath the surface of Eiradon. The walls of the underground chamber were carved from ancient stone, pulsating faintly with the magic of generations past. Her sisters, hooded and cloaked in the traditional garb of their order, stood in a circle around her, their faces shrouded in shadow. At the head of the circle was Seraphine, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. Her presence was a towering force, an immovable pillar of strength and authority. The coven's leadership had been passed down through centuries, and Seraphine embodied every ounce of the coven's legacy. Talia had looked up to her once, had trusted her wisdom above all others. But now, that trust was wavering. "Do you know why we're here, Talia?" Seraphine asked, her voice carrying the weight of ritual. Talia's pulse quickened. She knew this was more than a simple gathering of witches. The air was thick with magic, the kind that only came when ancient rites were about to be invoked. She could feel the eyes of the other witches on her, waiting for her answer. "I know we're on the brink of something catastrophic," Talia replied carefully. "The ley lines are fracturing. Something is trying to break through." Seraphine's gaze was hard. "And what do you propose we do about it?" Talia's thoughts raced. She had been researching the waking storm, diving deeper into the city's hidden past, consulting not just her coven's grimoire, but other forbidden texts. What she found terrified her. The ley lines didn't just crisscross under Eiradon. They converged in one place, an ancient nexus buried deep beneath the city. It was a place of immense power, where the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. And it was there that Nekhthar's prison lay. "We need to stabilize the nexus," Talia said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The ley lines converge there. If we can fortify it, we might be able to stop the fractures and prevent the waking storm from fully manifesting. Seraphine's eyes narrowed. And you believe you are capable of controlling such power? Talia met her gaze. If we don't try, the city will be consumed. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. Seraphine's face remained impassive, but Talia could sense the turmoil behind her cold demeanor. This was the kind of risk Seraphine had always avoided. Her leadership had always been about maintaining order, preserving the coven's power without inviting chaos. But now, chaos was already knocking at their door. Seraphine finally spoke, her voice low and grave. There is another way. Talia's stomach twisted. She had feared this. The ritual, Seraphine continued, stepping closer to the circle. Alira's ritual. It was written in the grimoire for a reason. Talia's breath caught in her throat. Alira's ritual was more than just a spell, it was a sacrifice. It was designed to seal away great power, to bind it to a place for eternity. But it came at a terrible cost, the life of the one who performed it. The ultimate price for balance. No, Talia said, her voice barely a whisper. There has to be another way. Seraphine's gaze was cold and unyielding. You think you can control this, Talia, but you can't. None of us can. Alira knew this. She sealed away the storm once before, and now it is our duty to do the same. Talia's hands trembled as she clenched her fists. She had always known that magic came with a price, but this was too much. There had to be another way, something they hadn't yet uncovered. There is still time, Talia said, her voice firmer now. Let me find another solution. I just need more time to... We don't have time, Seraphine interrupted, her voice sharp. The fractures are spreading. The longer we wait, the greater the risk. If we lose control, Nekhthar will rise, and everything will be lost. Talia looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other witches. Some of them averted their gaze, while others looked at her with pity. They believed Seraphine, believed that the only way to save the city was through Alira's ritual. But Talia wasn't ready to accept that. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. I'll find another way. Seraphine's expression darkened. You are defying the will of the coven. I'm defying a death sentence, Talia shot back. I won't sacrifice myself or anyone else for a ritual that may not even work. The tension in the room was palpable, magic crackling in the air like the precursor to a storm. Seraphine's lips thinned into a tight line, but she didn't argue further. Then you will act alone, Seraphine said, her voice colder than the grave. The coven will not support your reckless defiance. If you fail, you will not have our aid, and you will face the consequences of your actions alone. Talia nodded, the weight of her decision settling over her like a shroud. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But deep down, she knew she had made the right choice. Chapter 11. Broken Boundaries. As Talia made her way back to the surface, the city around her seemed to pulse with tension. The magic in the air had grown thick and oppressive, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. People moved through the streets as if unaware, but Talia could see the signs. The flickering of streetlights, the subtle tremors in the ground, the strange distortions in the air that only those attuned to magic could detect. Her thoughts churned as she walked. She needed to act quickly, but without the coven's support, she was on her own. Worse, Adrien had grown distant since their last encounter, and Talia wasn't sure if she could count on him anymore. Yet, there was no one else who understood the gravity of what they were facing as he did. As she approached her apartment, Talia felt the air shift around her, a subtle disturbance that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She paused, scanning the shadows, her senses heightened. You're being followed, a voice murmured from the alley. Talia spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger hidden in her coat. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, lean man with sharp features and eyes that glinted like steel. It was Adrien. He stepped forward, his expression serious. You need to be more careful. Talia let out a breath, though her muscles remained tense. I didn't think you'd come. Adrien gave a wry smile. I've been watching. This city is on the edge, and so are you. Talia met his gaze, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. I can't do this alone, Adrien. The coven, they've chosen a path I can't follow. Adrien's eyes flicked toward the darkened streets, his expression unreadable. The witches always think they can control everything, but sometimes the best you can do is survive. Talia clenched her fists. I'm not looking to survive, Adrien. I'm trying to save the city. Adrien stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. And that's what will get you killed. Their eyes locked, and for a moment... Chapter 12. Underworld Alliances. Talia stared into Adrien's eyes, seeing 1,000 years of calculated survival reflected back at her. He had thrived in Eiradon's darkness for centuries by making the hard choices, the ones that blurred the line between pragmatism and cruelty. But she wasn't like him. She wasn't content to simply survive. She wanted to stop the city from tearing itself apart. Yet, as the tension hung between them, she knew Adrien was right in his own way. This wasn't a battle anyone could win without blood, sacrifice, and impossible decisions. What do you suggest, then? Talia asked, her voice carrying a note of challenge. If you think my plan will get me killed, then what's your solution? Let the city fall? Run? Adrien's expression hardened, his gaze flickering with an emotion she rarely saw from him, something close to vulnerability, masked by his usual sharp edges. He looked out over the city, as though seeing it with the eyes of someone who had witnessed it rise and fall countless times before. There are forces older than the witches, older than the vampires, he said quietly. The kind of power you need to contain Nekhthar won't be found in a grimoire or a ritual. You're fighting a god of chaos, Talia. That requires chaos in return. Talia frowned, crossing her arms defensively. Chaos doesn't seem like something we should be inviting into this situation. Adrien's lips curved into a half smile, though there was no humor in it. Not all chaos is destructive. The vampires may be the most visible of the city's supernatural factions, but there are others. Forces that have remained hidden for centuries, feeding off the undercurrents of the city's energy. We call them the Veiled Ones. The name sent a chill through Talia. She had heard rumors, whispers in the coven of beings, even the witches didn't fully understand. The Veiled Ones were said to be shapeshifters, spirits of forgotten deities, or creatures that lived between dimensions, feeding off the magic that bled into the city's shadows. No one knew for sure what they were, only that they were as old as the city itself, and dangerous. And you think they'll help us? Talia asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. Adrien nodded slowly, his expression grave. They have a vested interest in Eiradon surviving. The city's ley lines are their lifeblood. If Nekhthar rises, everything here, supernatural and mortal, will be consumed. They'll act if they see a chance to preserve the balance. Talia weighed his words, a mix of hope and fear knotting in her chest. The idea of reaching out to these ancient beings was daunting, but Adrien had a point. If anyone could rival a force as old as Nekhthar, it would be the Veiled Ones. How do we find them? She asked. Adrien's smile widened, though it still didn't touch his eyes. I've already arranged that. The meeting place was deep within the underbelly of Eiradon, far beneath the crumbling ruins of an old cathedral that had been abandoned for decades. The tunnels beneath the city were a labyrinth, once used by smugglers and secret societies, now claimed by creatures that preferred the dark. It was a place where the walls breathed magic, where the air itself felt alive with ancient energy. Talia and Adrien moved through the narrow passageways, the silence between them thick with tension. Talia could feel the magic in the air, heavier with each step they took. The deeper they went, the more she sensed something watching them from the shadows, an awareness that seemed to pulse from the stone itself. How do you even know about these tunnels? Talia asked, her voice hushed as they rounded another corner. Adrien didn't break stride, his expression unreadable. I've been around long enough to learn the city's secrets, and these tunnels, they predate the city itself. Before Talia could ask him to elaborate, they reached a large iron door set into the wall of the tunnel. It was ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and twist in the dim light. Adrien placed his hand on the door, and Talia felt a surge of magic ripple through the air as the symbols began to glow faintly. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the tunnels. Beyond the door was a vast chamber, illuminated by a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to emanate from the very stone itself. The walls were carved with intricate patterns, some of which Talia recognized as old arcane symbols. But others were foreign to her, markings that predated even the oldest magic she had studied. In the center of the chamber stood 3 figures, their forms shifting and undulating as though they were made of smoke and shadow. They were neither fully human nor fully spirit, their features flickering between solid and ethereal. Their eyes, though, were constant, glowing with a cold, alien intelligence that sent a shiver down Talia's spine. One of them stepped forward, its voice a low, melodic whisper that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "We have been waiting for you, Adrien of the first line." Talia glanced at Adrien, surprised by the title. She had never heard anyone refer to him that way before. Adrien inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but didn't respond to the figure's greeting. "You know why we've come," Adrien said, his voice steady. The figure's eyes flicked to Talia, as though measuring her. "You seek to prevent the rise of the fallen god," it said, its voice carrying a note of amusement. "Do you truly believe you can stand against such a force?" Talia felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "We don't have a choice. If Nekhthar rises, the city will be destroyed. And if the city falls, the ley lines collapse. That affects you too." The other figures shifted slightly, as though discussing something silently amongst themselves. The lead figure's form flickered, its face momentarily becoming more human-like before fading back into shadow. "We are aware of the threat, but stopping Nekhthar is no simple task. The barriers between this world and the one beyond have already begun to weaken." Adrien stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We need your help to stabilize the ley lines and seal the breach. You have access to powers that neither the witches nor the vampires can control. With your intervention, we can reinforce the nexus." The lead figure's glowing eyes narrowed slightly, its expression inscrutable. "And what will you offer in return?" Talia felt a pang of dread. She knew enough about the supernatural to understand that nothing came without a price. The Veiled Ones were not altruistic. They were as old as the ley lines themselves, tied to the city's magic in ways that few understood. And they would demand something in exchange for their assistance. Adrien's gaze flicked briefly to Talia before he spoke. "You've thrived in Eiradon's shadows for centuries. We will guarantee your survival, even as the city changes. You'll be protected, free to move through the city's magic without interference from the witches or the vampire courts." The lead figure tilted its head, considering the offer. "You would grant us dominion over the city's hidden veins of power? And in return, we simply save it?" Adrien's voice was smooth, persuasive. "You save yourselves. If Nekhthar rises, there will be no ley lines left to feed from. The city will become a wasteland." The chamber fell into a tense silence as the Veiled Ones seemed to confer silently once more. Talia's heart raced, unsure of what Adrien was truly offering or how far he would go to secure their help. But she knew that without them, the chances of stopping Nekhthar were slim. Finally, the lead figure nodded, its form solidifying slightly. "Very well. We will assist you. But know this, once the fallen god stirs, the balance of power in this city will change. We will not be bound by your petty politics or your mortal rules. If we aid you, we claim the city's magic as our own." Adrien nodded, though Talia could see the flicker of tension in his jaw. Agreed. The deal was struck. Chapter 13. The Shifting Balance. As the Veiled Ones faded back into the shadows, the weight of their agreement pressed heavily on Talia's shoulders. She stood in the vast, echoing chamber, feeling the ancient magic pulse around her, intertwining with the city's undercurrent of power. Adrien, ever calm and collected, stepped back toward her, the shadows flickering faintly in his eyes. Talia couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a dangerous bargain. The Veiled Ones were unpredictable, and their motives were always self-serving. She knew that what they had offered was the best chance at stopping Nekhthar, but at what cost? The idea of them controlling the city's ley lines, unchecked by any coven or vampire court, was a terrifying prospect. "You've just handed them a lot of power, Adrien," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper in the cold, dark chamber. Adrien turned toward her, his expression still unreadable. "I handed them a chance to survive, Talia. Just like us." The words hung between them, and for a moment Talia wondered if she had misjudged Adrien all along. He was pragmatic, ruthless even, but he wasn't reckless. He knew the consequences of their deal, and yet he had struck the bargain with unnerving certainty. We don't know how they'll use that power, Talia pressed, crossing her arms defensively. Once Nekhthar is stopped, if we manage to stop him, what's to stop them from becoming a threat themselves? Adrien's gaze shifted, his eyes cold. That's a problem for another time. Right now, the city needs to survive. Talia clenched her fists, feeling frustration welling up inside her. Adrien's cold detachment, his willingness to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term survival, grated against everything she believed in. She had spent her life trying to preserve balance, to keep the coven's magic in harmony with the city's fragile ecosystem of power. And now it seemed that balance was being upended by forces she couldn't control. Veiled ones, ancient gods, and the ever-shifting loyalties of the vampire courts. Adrien began walking toward the iron door, his footfalls echoing in the empty chamber. We need to move quickly. The veiled ones will do their part, but Nekhthar is already stirring. We need to get back to the surface and start reinforcing the nexus. Talia followed, her mind racing. She knew Adrien was right about the urgency of the situation. Every minute they wasted brought Nekhthar closer to breaking free. But she couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her, the sense that the city was being pulled in too many directions. The coven had fractured, the vampires were divided, and now they had brought another ancient force into play, one that was neither loyal nor predictable. As they made their way through the labyrinth of tunnels, the air grew colder, more oppressive. Talia felt the faint tremors in the earth beneath her feet, a constant reminder that the city was on the verge of tearing itself apart. The fractures in the ley lines were growing more severe, and the once stable magic that flowed through Eiradon was becoming volatile. Adrien, she said after a long silence, why didn't you tell me about the veiled ones sooner? You've been working with them all along, haven't you? Adrien didn't slow his pace, but she saw the flicker of something in his expression, annoyance perhaps, or regret. The veiled ones prefer to stay hidden. I've had dealings with them before, yes, but they're not exactly the kind of allies you flaunt. Talia's eyes narrowed. And what else are you hiding from me? Adrien stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His face was calm, but there was a sharp edge to his voice when he spoke. You think this is about secrets, Talia? About trust? The city is falling apart and you're worried about alliances? There are bigger forces at play here than you or me, or even the coven. I'm doing what I have to do to keep this place from collapsing into the abyss. Talia bristled, her frustration bubbling over. But what if we're just trading one disaster for another? The veiled ones could easily become the next threat to the city, and you've given them the keys to the kingdom. Adrien's eyes flashed with irritation, but there was something deeper behind it, something Talia hadn't seen before. I don't care about their politics, Talia. I don't care about controlling the city or the ley lines. What I care about is survival, for all of us. His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Talia saw through the mask Adrien always wore. Beneath the centuries of calculated decisions, of manipulation and power games, there was a core of desperation, a survival instinct that had been honed over countless lifetimes. Adrien wasn't just playing a game of politics. He was trying to preserve something far more personal than just the city. But what was it? Chapter 14, The First Surge. By the time they reached the surface, the city was already beginning to fracture visibly. Talia could see it in the streets, the cracks forming in the pavement, the strange distortions in the air as the ley lines shifted uncontrollably. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. Adrien led them through the back alleys, avoiding the crowded main streets. The vampires, witches, and humans alike were all on edge, sensing the unnatural forces that churned beneath the surface. Talia saw the fear in their eyes as they passed, the way they glanced nervously at the flickering streetlights and the tremors underfoot. We need to get to the nexus point, Adrien said, his voice low and urgent. If the veiled ones do their part, we can reinforce the ley lines and stabilize the fractures before Nekhthar fully breaks through. Talia nodded, though her mind was still spinning. The nexus was the key, the point where the city's ley lines converged, deep beneath the surface. It was the most vulnerable part of the city's magical infrastructure, and if they could fortify it in time, they might be able to hold off the waking storm. But it was also the most dangerous place to be right now. As they rounded another corner, the ground trembled violently, and Talia stumbled, catching herself against a nearby wall. The air around them seemed to ripple, distorting like a heat mirage. She could feel the magic in the air twisting, growing chaotic. "We're running out of time," she muttered, her pulse quickening. Adrien didn't respond, but his pace quickened as they neared the entrance to the old subway station that led down to the Nexus. The station had long been abandoned, its once bustling platforms now overrun with decay and darkness. But it was the fastest way to reach the ley line convergence point. As they descended into the darkened tunnels, Talia's heart raced. She could feel the magic pulsing beneath her feet, growing stronger with every step. The Nexus was close, and so was the threat of Nekhthar breaking free. But as they approached the Nexus chamber, they weren't alone. A figure stood in the center of the room, bathed in the faint glow of the ley lines. Her silver hair gleamed in the dim light, and her eyes were cold, calculating. Seraphine. Talia's breath caught in her throat as she saw the High Witch standing there, her expression unreadable. Around her, several witches from the coven stood in silent formation, their magic crackling in the air. They were preparing for something dangerous. "You're too late, Talia," Seraphine said softly, her voice carrying a note of finality. "The ritual is already in motion." Talia's heart sank as she realized what Seraphine was doing. The High Witch wasn't trying to stabilize the ley lines. She was attempting Aelira's ritual, the one that would seal Nekhthar away at the cost of a life. But the magic swirling around Seraphine was different, darker, more volatile. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a binding far older than anything in the coven's grimoire. "What are you doing, Seraphine?" Talia demanded, stepping forward. "You'll destroy everything." Seraphine's eyes flickered with something close to pity. "No, Talia. I'm saving the city, just as Aelira did. And you'll see why this is the only way." As Seraphine raised her hands, the ley lines around them surged, and Talia felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. The air was thick with power, ancient and wild. But this time, it wasn't just Nekhthar they were dealing with. It was Seraphine's hubris. Talia's mind raced as she realized the full scope of what was about to happen. They weren't just fighting a god anymore. They were fighting time itself. Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. Talia stood frozen as the raw power surged through the chamber, her breath catching in her throat. Seraphine's ritual had already taken hold of the ley lines, the ancient magic weaving itself into something dangerous and unpredictable. The ground beneath them thrummed with energy, and Talia could feel the nexus at the heart of Eiradon vibrating with barely contained chaos. Adrien stepped forward, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. His vampire instincts, honed over centuries, recognized the sheer peril of Seraphine's actions. He glanced at Talia, and though no words were exchanged, there was a mutual understanding. They had to stop this before it was too late. Seraphine's eyes glowed with an eerie light, her connection to the ley lines deepening with every passing second. She looked ethereal, almost inhuman, as if the magic flowing through her had transformed her into something else entirely. Her witches stood behind her in a trance-like state, their own power feeding into the ritual, amplifying the spell Seraphine was attempting to cast. "What have you done?" Talia demanded, her voice breaking through the tension. "This isn't the ritual Aelira used. You're twisting the ley lines. You're binding them to yourself." Seraphine's expression didn't waver, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, determination mixed with sorrow. "I've made a choice, Talia. One that Aelira wasn't willing to make. This city will fall unless we control the magic that flows through it. Nekhthar isn't just a threat to us. He's a reminder that we can't leave these forces unchecked." Talia shook her head, stepping closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not trying to stop Nekhthar. You're trying to take his place. You're binding the ley lines to yourself so you can control the city's magic." Seraphine's gaze hardened, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "The coven's strength has been fractured for too long. The vampires, the veiled ones, the ancient gods, they've all had a stake in Eiradon's magic, but never us. We've always been the protectors, the keepers of balance. It's time we became more than that. It's time we became the source. Talia's heart sank as she realized the full scope of Seraphine's plan. She wasn't just trying to stabilize the ley lines. She was using the Nexus to turn herself into a conduit for the city's magic, to take control of the entire ley line network. If she succeeded, she would have unimaginable power, but at a cost that would ripple through the city for generations. Adrien's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. You won't survive this, Seraphine? No one can channel that much magic and live. You'll burn yourself out, and you'll take the entire city with you. Seraphine's eyes flickered toward Adrien, her lips curling into a faint smile. That's where you're wrong, vampire. I've prepared for this. I know what I'm doing. Talia's pulse quickened as she stepped even closer, desperate to break through Seraphine's resolve. You don't have to do this, Seraphine. We can stop Nekhthar together without sacrificing everything. This isn't the way. But Seraphine's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder, more distant. You're still thinking too small, Talia. This isn't about Nekhthar anymore. It's about power. It's about ensuring the coven's survival, ensuring our survival. With this magic, we'll be untouchable. We won't have to live in fear of ancient gods or vampire courts or anything else. Talia shook her head, her throat tightening. But at what cost, Seraphine? You'll destroy everything we've worked for. The ley lines are the lifeblood of the city. They're not meant to be controlled like this. Before Seraphine could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a deep guttural sound echoed through the chamber. Talia's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Nekhthar was stirring. The ancient god, trapped beneath the city for centuries, was awakening, drawn to the immense magical disturbance Seraphine's ritual had caused. The air in the chamber grew thick with tension as the walls seemed to ripple with energy. Dark tendrils of magic began to seep through the cracks in the stone, swirling toward the Nexus, coiling around Seraphine like a living shadow. Adrien's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the blade at his side. He's coming, he muttered, his voice laced with urgency. We're out of time. Talia's heart raced as she realized the truth. Nekhthar wasn't just awakening. He was being drawn to Seraphine's power, attracted to the raw chaos she had unleashed. If the ritual continued, Nekhthar would break free, and Seraphine's plan to control the ley lines would be shattered. The ancient god would consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. Talia's mind raced, searching for a solution. She knew that stopping Seraphine directly would be impossible. Her connection to the ley lines was too strong. But there had to be a way to break the ritual, to sever her control over the magic before it was too late. Adrien's voice pulled her from her thoughts. We need to disrupt the ley lines, he said, his eyes locked on the glowing nexus at the center of the room. If we can overload the convergence point, it might destabilize the ritual long enough to stop Nekhthar from breaking through. Talia's eyes widened as the implications of Adrien's plan hit her. Overloading the ley lines would be dangerous, potentially catastrophic. It could cause a magical backlash that would tear through the city, but it was the only way to break Seraphine's hold and stop Nekhthar from rising. We don't have another option, Adrien said, reading the hesitation in Talia's expression. It's either that, or we let her finish the ritual, and we all know what happens if Nekhthar gets free. Talia swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She knew Adrien was right. They were out of time, and the only way to stop this disaster was to take a massive risk. But the thought of destroying the ley lines, the very source of the city's magic, was almost unbearable. But as the ground beneath them shook again, and the dark tendrils of magic grew thicker, Talia knew there was no other choice. Fine, she said, her voice shaking with resolve. But we have to move fast. Adrien nodded, his expression grim. Together, they rushed toward the Nexus, the glowing lines of magic pulsing with energy. Talia could feel the raw power coursing through the room, the air thick with tension as they approached the heart of the ley line convergence. With a quick motion, Adrien unsheathed his blade, its edge glowing faintly with enchanted silver. He moved swiftly, slicing through the thin tendrils of magic that coiled around the Nexus, disrupting the delicate balance of the ritual. Talia followed suit, using her own magic to channel a surge of energy into the Nexus, destabilizing the flow of power. For a brief moment, everything went still. And then the nexus exploded. A wave of pure energy rippled through the chamber, knocking Talia off her feet and sending shockwaves through the earth. The ley lines surged with chaotic power, their carefully maintained structure unraveling as the magic spiraled out of control. Talia could hear Seraphine's scream of rage and pain as the ritual collapsed around her, the magic she had tried to control now turning against her. The ground trembled violently, and Talia struggled to her feet, her vision blurred by the sheer force of the magical backlash. She could feel the ley lines tearing apart beneath the city, the very fabric of Eiradon's magical infrastructure unraveling. But as she looked up, she saw something incredible. The breach to the other world was closing. The disruption had worked. Nekhthar, the ancient god, was being pulled back into the void, his dark tendrils retreating into the depths of the earth as the ley lines snapped back into place. The city's magic, though damaged, was healing itself, reweaving the strands of power that had been torn apart. But Seraphine was not so lucky. Talia's eyes locked onto the High Witch, who lay crumpled at the center of the chamber, her body still glowing faintly with residual magic. Seraphine's connection to the ley lines had been severed, and the backlash of power had ravaged her. She was barely conscious, her once formidable presence reduced to a fragile, broken figure. Talia approached slowly, her heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Seraphine had been her mentor, her guide through the world of magic. And yet, in the end, her ambition had driven her to make the ultimate mistake. Seraphine's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Talia with a faint, bitter smile. "I thought I could save us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Talia knelt beside her, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch Seraphine's shoulder. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "We could have stopped him together." Seraphine's smile faded, her gaze distant. "I was wrong," she murmured, her breath growing shallow. "But I just wanted to make us strong." Talia felt a tear slip down her cheek as Seraphine's eyes closed, her body going still. The chamber was silent, save for the faint hum of the ley lines slowly stabilizing. The danger had passed, but the cost had been immense. Adrien stepped forward, his expression somber as he looked down at Seraphine's lifeless form. "It's over," he said quietly. "The city is safe, for now." Talia nodded, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. The coven was fractured, the ley lines damaged, and the balance of power in Eiradon had shifted irrevocably. But they had stopped Nekhthar. They had saved the city. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Epilogue. Shadows of Tomorrow. Eiradon had changed. The city still stood, its skyline as imposing as ever, but the air was different. The tension that had once simmered beneath the surface had eased, replaced by a cautious peace. The ley lines, though still damaged, were healing, their magic slowly knitting the city back together. The coven was rebuilding, though without Seraphine's guiding hand, its future remained uncertain. Talia stood on the balcony of her apartment, gazing out over the city as dusk settled in. The horizon was painted in shades of deep orange and violet, the first stars twinkling faintly in the sky. She could feel the magic in the air, calmer now, more balanced. But she knew that this peace was fragile. Adrien stood beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. They hadn't spoken much since the events in the Nexus chamber. There were no words that could fully capture the weight of what they had been through, what they had lost. But they understood each other in a way that words didn't require. "The city will recover," Adrien said finally, his voice low and steady. Talia nodded, though her thoughts were far away. "But at what cost?" Adrien was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "Every battle leaves scars, but we survive." Talia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. "What now?" Adrien's gaze drifted toward the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Now we rebuild, the coven, the city, and ourselves." Talia let out a slow breath, her heart still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. But as she looked out over Eiradon, the city she had fought so hard to protect, she knew that there was still hope. The witches and vampires, the humans and veiled ones, they had all been part of this fragile, dangerous balance. And though the battle was over, the future was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Talia believed that they might find a way to make it work. together. And as the night settled over the city, the stars above shining brighter than ever, Talia felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. The future of Eiradon was still unwritten, but it was hers to protect.